To three.
Okay, so we're on Nun Daled Amud Aleph, and we started a different focus in the whole question of Maser Sheni and what happens with and this Indian of a Chomesh. And we started last week, and I'll repeat because I think a number of us were not here. So to pick up, we give a little background. So we started off by asking the question, since we know that Maser Sheni, along with other Kodesh, to be redeemed requires a Chomesh. In other words, you have to give an additional 20% of the value of the Maser Sheni if you're redeeming your own Maser Sheni. So the question arises, very interestingly, does the giving of the Chomesh, is it an integral part of the Maser Sheni, so that if you don't give the Chomesh or withhold the Chomesh, you can't use the Maser Sheni? So that's a very critical question, because if the Chomesh is an add-on, okay, it's an add-on, you can still redeem the Maser Sheni, and then the Chomesh comes later, or somehow you work the Chomesh in. But if it's an integral part of the whole redemption process, then if you don't give the Chomesh, you can't eat the Maser Sheni, you can't redeem it. So that's a very vital question that the Gemara is asking here in Nun Daled Amud Aleph. And let's quickly go over that Gemara because it'll be germane to our continuation. So the Gemara starts Iboyalahu, which is, we're going to go back. Iboyalahu, it's about maybe a dozen lines or so from the top, second word in, maybe 10 lines. This is the Gemara's kasha. Chomesh ma'akev or ain't ma'akev? Does a chomesh, is it ma'akev? Does it prevent the Maser Sheni from being redeemed, as we said, if you don't give it on the spot? Or does it not prevent? In other words, it's an add-on and you owe it, but it doesn't affect the actual Maser Sheni. And by the way, this applies not only to Maser Sheni, but if you want to redeem or bimachal something from the Beis Hamikdash, or you take something that's not kosher and you want to exchange it, so you want to redeem it so that you can bring something proper to the Beis Hamikdash, all the things having to do with kedusha that you have to in some way redeem. So that's the question, whether or not the chomesh is me'akev or not. So the Gemara. So now, what's the kasha? What is the question? So the question is, Daled b'Daled porek, v'abenafshe moisif chomesh, v'kanafshe moisif chomesh. In other words, analyzing the actual question is that if you have 4 zuzim, Daled b'Daled, you have 4 zuzim of Maser Sheni, you exchange it for 4 zuzim. That's it. What about the chomesh? And separately, you have to add the chomesh, because we know that if someone else, in the case of a third party redeeming something shebekodesh, there is no chomesh. Only you yourself have to pay the chomesh if you redeem your own. So then you see, maybe there's some flexibility in the chomesh that it isn't attached to the Maser Sheni, and therefore you can redeem the Maser Sheni. Or, says the Gemara, Dilma Arba b'Chamisha Porek. No, initially you're exchanging 4 for 5. In other words, it's not 4 for 4 plus 1, it's 4 for 5. That you're exchanging 4 zuzim of Maser Sheni for 5 zuzim of cash, right? The chomesh ma'akev. In which case the chomesh is just as important as the actual other 4. So that's how the kasha breaks down, whether that chomesh is part or not part of the actual exchange. So, or can you somehow sever it and then say, okay, I owe it, but I'm not going to withhold the Maser Sheni. That's the kasha. All right. So Omer Ravina. So Ravina wants to bring a raya from a brisa, a Mishnah actually. Okay, the Mishnah is a Mishnah in Mesechet Demai, and Demai we know is Sofek Maser. In other words, Sofek Maser Sheni. But why is it Sofek? Because it's in the possession of a they say Amoritz. I mean, the Amoratzim of those days were not necessarily Amoratzim, but because there was a chashash that a doubt as to whether or not he gave Maser Sheni, so midoraisa, it not a problem. But the rabbis came and said, no, we have to do an add-on. But there was a limitation to the add-on. What's the limitation? Hadamai ein lo chomesh ve'ein lo biur. In other words, if you're dealing with demai, then there's no chomesh. You don't have to give the add-on 20%. So right away we see that we're going to learn something, because in this case you don't have to give the chomesh. Also, the ein lo biur is a separate matter. In other words, leftover Maser Sheni at the end of the 3rd and 6th year of the cycle, of the 7-year cycle, that food has to be destroyed. In other words, if it's not used or eaten, then it's sort of over zman. It loses its ability to be exchanged b'kaidesh, and you have to burn it. But demai is not subject to that law. So we see that there are kulas. It's not as severe as if it were a Maser Sheni of a Jew who we can say 100% he gave. This is a questionable Maser Sheni. All right. So what do we learn from this? What's the pshat? Okay. So we say demai is different than regular Maser Sheni. So Ravina now wants to draw from this Mishnah a proof to the question of whether or not Chaimish is ma'akiv or not. What's the proof? Har keren yeshla. In the case of demai Maser Sheni, we say the keren is definitely has to be redeemed. In other words, even demai is treated like any other Maser Sheni, that you have to redeem it. If you don't redeem it, you can't eat it outside Yerushalayim. So that is clear. My tama. So what's the chilek then with regard to demai? Why there is no chaimish? Keren dema'akev b'deraisa. So a principle, meaning the Maser Sheni itself, which is ma'akev b'deraisa, is required by the Torah to redeem, right? So b'deraisa, you're still machayev isa midrabanan. So that is also requires midrabanan. But chomesh telo akiv midaraisa. But chomesh, which is not midaraisa, because we learned from the Mishnah hadamai and lo chomesh. So if initially there's no deraisa, less than midrabanan, it's not required by the rabbis either. In other words, midaraisa. If you have midaraisa, then it flows down midrabanan. But if midaraisa, there is no inyan of chomesh, because the Mishnah says adamai ein lo chomesh, so we know midaraisa there's no chomesh. Then the rabbis don't put on an extra sort of chumrah to say that you're mechayiv.
Excuse me, Rabbi. Michael has a great question, and I have one after.
I'm not sure. It's actually, I'm confused, and I missed last week, so I apologize.
No, we're going to go over this. Go ahead.
But I don't understand the fundamental issue. So if I'm exchanging, I'm selling my Maser Sheni for an amount. The amount
selling may not be the right word, Michael. Redeeming.
I'm going to say, but I'm redeeming it. But I'm redeeming it from a merchant. I'm not redeeming it from the Beis Hamikdash. I'm redeeming it from a merchant. So the value that I get for it is the value that it's worth. Correct. I'm not saying I'm giving you 5 for 4. I'm giving you 4 for the value. Then does the chomesh mean I add value to it to make the chomesh in terms of money, or is the process under the core Gemara that I have to redeem 5 for 4? So whoever redeems it for me is going to get a benefit from that redemption, and that's Kodesh.
Right. So the Torah says as follows. The Torah says you're mechuyev in Maser Sheni. You are a farmer in the Chutz Yerushalayim, and you have to bring Maser Sheni to Yerushalayim. Now, instead of course, you're too far away, so you have to redeem it so that you can have fresh produce in Yerushalayim, and that's all fine and good. Now, the onus is on you, the farmer, you're saying, I have 4 zuzim worth of Masasheni. I want to bring those 4 zuzim, but of course, that produce, of course, I can't carry it to Yerushalayim, so I have to redeem it. Then the Torah says, by you, the owner, the farmer, redeeming the Masasheni, you have to add a fifth. You have to add the fifth, and then go ahead to Yerushalayim. If I were to sell that Masasheni to Jay, and Jay were to buy it from me, Jay doesn't have to give me a chomesh because I'm doing a arm's length exchange outside of my own parameters. And I take the money that Jay gives me, I go to Yerushalayim and I redeem, and Jay can eat the food, and there's no chomesh in the picture. But because you, Michael, are the farmer, and you want to redeem your own produce, says the Torah, we're going to put a tax. Let's call it a chomesh. Let's call it a tax for lack of a better term. I'm going to tax you, and you have to go to Yerushalayim with 5 zuz, 4 for the Masasheni, and a chomesh, or whatever the chomesh comes out to be, depending. And again, now we're going to get into the discussion of whether it's from the outside or the inside. But forget about that, machlokes. You have to give 20% of the value of the produce and add that and go to Yerushalayim because it's because you did it.
Okay, so but you're adding 5. The one who redeems it gives you 4.
Correct.
And so because and that discharges your liability, but the one who redeems it from you gets the benefit of that 5, and all of that makes it kodesh because you gave him more than the value.
No. The person you're redeeming it with, you're paying extra because the halacha is that you have to. When you get to Yerushalayim and you're paying 5 shekalim worth of your stuff, 5 shekels instead of 4 shekels, you're getting 5 shekels worth of stuff.
Okay, so let's back up to the first part. That's what I was trying to understand. Thank you, Menashe. But I'm giving who I redeem it to, I give 5, and that
No, Michael, I think, Michael, you're confusing something here. So let me try to clarify. Are you talking about, if you're talking about, I have 4 zuzim worth of Maser Sheni, and I happen not to have, you're the owner, and you happen not to have the money to redeem it with, so you go to the open market, and you say, whoever wants to buy these 4 zuzim, I'd like to give you this is Maser Sheni. You'll give me the 4 zuzim. The Maser Sheni will become whole. It'll become regular food that anybody can eat. And the outside person redeeming it will give me 4 zuzim. I do not have to add a 5th because I didn't redeem it myself. I let Jay redeem it. So then now you go up with the 4 zuzim, cash it in Yerushalayim, and make a big Suda Maser Sheni with the 4 zuzim. End of story.
That's.
But if you say, you know what, I want to have the schus of redeeming it, I'm going to redeem it. The Torah says if you will redeem your own produce, we're going to add a chomesh, and you have to redeem it with 5 zuzim for 4 zuzim worth of food, and you take the entire 5 zuzim to Yerushalayim, make a big suda, and you mekayim the mitzvah. So that chomesh doesn't apply to selling it outside to a third party. It only applies when you yourself redeem your own, which most people will try to do. So then the Torah says, in that case, you have to give a chomesh. That chomesh becomes kodesh, as in other cases, because you now have the value of that Maser Sheni has upped to 5 zuzim because you bought it yourself. That's the condition.
But if I'm redeeming it myself, I'm bringing all 5 zuzim value worth of produce to Yerushalayim. I'm redeeming it in Yerushalayim.
Correct.
And I'm giving 5 in exchange for 4.
No, you're giving 5 in Yerushalayim. You're going to buy 5 zuzim worth of produce in Yerushalayim, in Machane Yehuda, wherever you go.
Because
all 5 are kodesh, and then you'll make the suda.
Let me put it a different way. The change from 4 to 5 happens outside Yerushalayim as a convenience for you to be able to bring money to Yerushalayim instead of bringing a truckload of produce to Yerushalayim.
Correct.
Okay.
And so for the, in a sense, for the benefit of being able to do that, you pay a penalty, which is why you now have to bring 5 times instead of 4 times. No, it's 5/4 as much money. Once it's money, it's just standard transactions from there on out, except that those transactions have to be in Yerushalayim.
So who is able to benefit from the 5 for 4?
Yeah, and you're benefiting yourself because you're buying it for
Right.
yourself to eat. But Menashe,
Right, you're still eating the same. You're eating now. You're going to eat 5 worth of food instead of 4 worth of food. So in a sense, you benefit yourself. So in a sense, you haven't lost money by doing it. However, it forces you to spend more of your money in Yerushalayim.
Okay, so you have to spend 5 then at that point in
That's
Yerushalayim.
correct.
I'm
That's
sorry. Thank you for explaining.
right.
Maybe
So,
it's basic, but I didn't get it.
now the question becomes, Michael, if I redeem it and I don't have 5 zuzim in my pocket, I only have 4, can I redeem it and owe, or the redemption doesn't get off the ground because it requires 5? That's the Gemara's kasha. Because how do we treat that chomesh? And just for clarification, Menashe, I wouldn't use the word penalty. I would say that the Torah has said that for your own convenience, if you're going to exchange it, then there's a bigger burden on you to not even a kanas. It's not even a penalty. It's the fact that that food is kodesh. So in order to redeem kodesh, as in other cases of redeeming kodesh, we say that there's sort of an extra tax, extra burden, not so much as a penalty, but the Torah says it's above and beyond what you should do for the mitzvah. So let's call it maybe l'fnim mishur sadin. We'll use that term.
It's really another mitzvah, though.
It's another mitzvah.
So it's not like you're being
exactly, Jay. It's a mitzvah.
Is
a mitzvah. Correct.
The question I had after Michael, you're finished? Okay, because the question I have is, where does the logic come in that you combine them to 5 on the way to, before you leave your farm? Now, why would you think that they should be combined? It's a 5, it's a 4, plus in your other pocket you put a 1, because that is the chomesh. Why was there some question earlier?
Because the Torah didn't clarify. The Torah says that if you go ahead and redeem, you have to bring a chomesh. The Torah, in its own words, because of the brevity of the pasuk, never really identified and said that chomesh was part and parcel. And you understand that once that that's fodder in a sense for the Gemara to delve into and to say, okay, we get it, you have to give 5, but from the Torah we don't understand whether the 5 becomes a 5 or a 4 plus 1. In other words, the Torah didn't say 4 plus 1. The Torah didn't say 5. The Torah says you have to add a chomesh, and because it says adding a chomesh, that opens the door to interpretation. What does it mean? And you have to add a chomesh.
Why would you think that that you add it and it becomes a 5, a story about 5, rather than a story of 4 plus 1? I don't understand why.
Yosef Alav. You're adding to it. So I would understand. I'm sure there's different opinions, but the idea that you're adding to it, it becomes one larger whole.
Right. So again, we always go. We did last week. We'll go back to the pasuk, and the pasuk is it's in B'chol Kosai at the end of Vayikra. So let's take a look at what the pasuk says.
Excuse me a second. I have something else to attend to.
Okay. So it talks about Behemoth Tameya, but remember, by redeeming Kodesh is the same as Masa Sheni. So Jay is going to be back. Okay. V'im behemoth hatameya ufoda be'erkecha, and if he this has to do with a Behemoth Tameya that you want to be able to take the money and redeem, that then he should take the value be'erkecha the Yosef Chamishiso olav. and add a fifth to it. Now, I want Jay to hear this because I want him to answer the question. So it says the Yosef Hamishiso Allah, which is an important phrase because we're going to learn the interpretation in more detail later. So what does it mean? And he has to add a fifth. Does that add? That's where the ambiguity comes in, whether the add-on now becomes part of the redemption or is in addition to the redemption, which makes a big difference in the case of Maser Sheni, that it's not ma'akev on the spot. And if he doesn't have the money, it doesn't prevent him from eating Maser Sheni or the equivalent of in Yerushalayim, and he owes the money. And we're going to see from the Gemara as we go on that owing the money isn't the worst thing in the world, because there's a way for the Hagdish or Yerushalayim, there's a way of collecting it, but it doesn't have to be on the spot and doesn't stop the whole process of eating Maser Sheni in Yerushalayim. So that's really the question, and that's what we're grappling with. So, okay, I mean, that was Jay's question, but so again, it's wide open. The question is wide open. Do we not? So what's the proof? What did we just learn from this brisa? We learned from what we just said about the Mai that at least from the Mai we see the Chomish is not ma'akiv. We don't have a proof from anywhere else, but we're going to extrapolate that in Demai, since the Torah does not say that Demai requires a Chomish, that we see that there is a loophole that in not every case is Chomish required. So we're going to widen the loophole and we're going to say, well, if it's not required by Demai, so it's not Ma'akiv, so it's not going to be Ma'akiv by regular Maser Sheni. It's a legitimate argument. You can argue either way, but Ravina wants to say, this is my proof that since there is one weak link, where by Demai, then we're going to widen that link, and we're going to say that the same applies to every Dover Kodesh. So, Jay, just to finish, because you asked the question, because in the case of the Pasuk in Vayikra, it says that you have to redeem, and then the words of the Pasuk are V'yosaf Hamishiso Allah. You add a fifth.
Okay.
The words adding a fifth opens the door to the question of whether the adding the fifth is ma'akev. We add it, and it's now mandatory on the 4. Oh no, it's not mandatory. It's mandatory, but not on the 4. So the 4 can go forward and be redeemed. The extra 1 is necessary, but doesn't have to happen at the same time. So you can go on your merry way to Yerushalayim, redeem your Maser Sheni, have a big Suda, and then don't worry, we'll get to you and we'll get that extra fifth, and we'll collect it later, and then not worry about it.
You still bring it as a total 4 plus 1 unit.
Yes, but interestingly enough, inherent in the question is the fact, which nobody has asked, but it's inherent in the question, does that chomesh have to be eaten in Yerushalayim as part of Maser Sheni? It would seem from this whole question that it does not, because the 4 for 4, that for sure has to be eaten. But since chomesh is an add-on, the Yosef Chamishi Selav, and we're going to say it doesn't have to be simultaneous, then by definition, he doesn't have to come back to Yerushalayim just for the chomesh. So if he doesn't do it in his visit to Yerushalayim and he does it later, it's okay. He'll bring it later and it'll be done.
He has to keep it separate though in order to.
Well, yeah, no, he'll take that money. Sure, that money will then ultimately
Separate envelope.
Right. Now, the Gemara is going to ask a different question later, just to give you a preview. Does the chomesh have to be in kind? Does the chomesh have to be the same kind of redemption as the actual Maser Sheni, meaning food stuff? Just like the Maser Sheni is food, and you're redeeming it for money to buy food. Does the chomesh have to be in food, or could it be in something else, i.e. money?
Gasoline for your car.
But that's a separate question. We'll address that later. But the reason why I'm just mentioning is because you see this whole idea of chomesh is fraught with all kinds of ancillary questions as to whether or not The Torah wants you to bring it, but the Torah doesn't require it simultaneous, or the Torah doesn't require you necessarily to have it at the time to eat. As long as you bring the Chumash to the Beis Hamikdash, that's fine. But you don't have to necessarily have it at the same time. So these are all the different questions, and why there's ambiguity, because the Torah does not make it definitive.
So the Chumash can be tzedakah, you give it right at the base of Mikdash.
Exactly.
Wall.
Havamina, yes.
At the-
Tzedakah that you can put in the bed for the Bedek Habayis, let them use
Right.
it for other holy things.
Okay,
Right. Okay.
so it's a lot more flexible than the
Exactly right.
version from Ma'aser Sheni.
That's the question. But the other side of the coin is no, we're not going to let you redeem your Maser Sheni of 4 zuzim until you have the 5th. And then that whole package of 5 is what you bring to Yerushalayim. That's the other view. The Gemara just said now, Ravina said, I believe the correct view is 4 plus 1. Because why? Because by Demai, we see that there's no Chomesh. If it was absolutely mandatory in every case, then Demai shouldn't be different. Why is Demai excluded? Demai is a questionable thing anyway. But if you're already going to say bring it all. Why are you distinguishing in Demai not to bring it all and choose? It's a facsimile of what regular Maser Sheni is. I mean, from a Talmid Chacham or somebody else. Anyway,
Well, Rabbi, the spirit.
Yeah, David.
It may be only the spirit of the law rather than the letter, but the spirit of the Maser Sheni is certainly to have the food shared with the Levi, the orphan, the widow, etc., etc. They're supposed to benefit from the food being eaten in Yerushalayim.
Right.
Not sure Bedek Habayis helps.
No, it's a big suda. You make a big suda, sure.
Yeah. So I mean, it would seem to be that it would be better to give it in a form of tzedakah that benefits the unfortunate than Bedek Habayis, which was the upkeep of the temple itself.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, so you give it in a way that it would be equal to what you would be doing for Maser Sheni, correct? So that it can be for the enjoyment of the people who would otherwise enjoy from the suda of Maser Sheni, correct? Yeah. But here we see that, okay, it's not so ma'akiv. So, we don't do it right away. We defer it. It doesn't have the same level of pressure to bring the Maser Sheni that you've now converted into chol. So, but anyway, so the Gemara at this point wants to show that we have a resolution to the question according to Ravina, because we're saying that that it's not required in a Rabbanan case, which is Demai. Therefore, we're going to extrapolate the same is true otherwise. Okay. Now, having said all this, as we see in the Gemara often, the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, this whole discussion is a machlekes tanoim. In other words, we want to put an imprimatur. Not only do you see this discussion, but the tanoim even had this discussion. Why? Let's say that this discussion that we're having is a machlekes tanoim. What was the machlekes? Nosen as a kem, v'lo nosen as a chomesh. This is the Brisa where they said if a person, it says in Beferish in these words, if a person redeemed Maser Sheni, the principle, the keren, the loy nos he didn't give the chaymesh, we have a direct machlekes. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yochel. Eliezer says he can, you can take. Now here the focus was on the redeemed Maser Sheni, which is where in Chutz La'aretz. So he says that whoever you redeemed it to in Chutz La'aretz can eat it without a problem, no reservation, right? Rabbi Yeshua Omer, and Rabbi Yeshua says no, you can't eat it outside Yerushalayim because the chomesh was not given. All right, so it doesn't get clearer than that. That's the machlokes. That's our actual discussion. So now, what again? We're going to delve into it. Omar Rebbe. So how do we? Rebbe wants to reconcile the machlokes. He said, well, it's not really a machlokes because they're dealing with different situations. What does he say? Near and Rabbi Eliezer b'Shabbos, that the words of Rabbi Eliezer are applicable on Shabbos. We'll see what that means in a minute. The Dibur Rabbi Yeshua b'chol, and Rabbi Yeshua's words apply in chol. So what does it mean? It means that really, you can't eat it. B'chol, meaning in the regular day, you can't eat it. Rabbi Eliezer says you can. He's carving out an exception on Shabbos, l'kovet Shabbos, as Rashi would say, for tanuge Shabbos, meaning that Shabbos overrides the question of whether or not Chomesh can hold back Masa Sheni. So it would seem to say that Rabbi Eliezer, we don't know. What would Rabbi Eliezer say in Chol? The Gemara is going to tell us in a minute how to interpret it or how we're looking at it. But from Rebbe's point of view, in the Brisa, there was a chilik, a machlokes, only because Rabbi Eliezer said that Shabbos has a greater sanctity than the issue of Chomesh in Masa Sheni. That's how Rabbi Eliezer puts it, and Rabbi Yeshua, speaking about Chol, he's speaking only about a weekday when Shabbos doesn't override. There's no Shabbos issue, and therefore he says that the Chomesh is ma'akev, and without it you cannot eat the Masa Sheni. All right. So initially, that's how the machlokes is. Now, let's get into the machlokes. Since, and again, this is just on the surface, and clearly we can argue this, but on the surface, the Gemara is saying it would appear, miklal, the pligi afilu b'chol. It would appear just from the words that Rabbi said in the Brisa, about the Brisa, that Rabbi Eliezer argues even b'chol that you can eat it without the chomesh. Okay? That's how he's interpreting it. I know you can argue right away, no, but he is saying that Rabbi Eliezer Shita, since he is talking about Shabbos, but really he's talking about not Shabbos too, and saying you can always eat it without the chomesh. That's how we're now interpreting the Gemara. And on the flip side, Rabbi Yeshua b'chol, since we interpreted that Rabbi Yeshua says you can't eat the Masa Sheni, it's because it's chol, miklal, the pligi afilu b'Shabbos, that he's arguing that even on Shabbos, Shabbos does not supersede the Masa Sheni, if you didn't bring a chomesh. So on the surface, he's saying that Rabbi Yeshua l'shitasoi and Rabbi Eliezer l'shitaso. He only gives us the head note of saying that Rabbi Eliezer is speaking about Shabbos and Rabbi Yeshua is speaking about Chol, but in reality, they hold this. Each one holds the same view for Shabbos and Chol, but he's only pointing out the differences between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. That's how the Gemara wants to interpret it. It's not clear on its face. Clearly, it's not clear. But that would seem to be the idea. Now, why do we say that? Why do we say that everybody's lishitaso? My lad v'hai svara kamifadli. Isn't it because this svara that we're about to articulate is really the source of the machlekes? The Rabbi Eliezer sovar chomish lo mi'akev. Rabbi Eliezer says that chomish is not mi'akev, meaning it's not required. Therefore, it doesn't matter Shabbos or Chol. In each case, you can go ahead. On Shabbos, okay, Shabbos is the reason, because it's Shabbos. But in Chol, also you can eat it because chomish is ma'akev, and therefore you can eat the Masa Sheni on Chol. And Rabbi Yeshua sava chomish ma'akev. But Rabbi Yeshua holds chomish is ma'akev, and therefore, if it's ma'akev, it should be ma'akev on Shabbos too. Oh, you're going to give me a reason because Shabbos is Tainik Shabbos and everything else. But the Torah says adding a chomesh, and I'm interpreting that add-on is mandatory. What? Just because it's Shabbos? I can't do. I want to ride my car. I have a beautiful car. It gives me great pleasure, nachas ruach, to go into my fancy car and drive it on Shabbos. Wait a minute, you can't drive a car on Shabbos. Why not? It's Tanugei Shabbos. Teretz is Tanugei Shabbos isn't an issue according to Rabbi Yeshua. The halacha is, according to the Torah, in his interpretation, that a chomesh is required, and therefore it's required on Shabbos too. This is just by way of understanding each person's thinking. So, and Rebbe is saying that just because Rabbi Yeshua says it's chol, it also means Shabbos, and just because Rabbi Eliezer says Shabbos, it also means chol. So that's how we're learning the pshat and the Gemara. So again, just to understand that each one is lishitaso and is not makel or machmir whether it's Shabbos or not Shabbos. That's if it's Shabbos, it's wonderful. It's Shabbos, but it's not because Shabbos supersedes the mitzvah. No, the mitzvah is you have to give a chomesh, and if you have to give a chomesh, Shabbos is not ma'akev. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, of course, it's not an issue because it's not ma'akev. It's you have to give it, but it's not ma'akev. So Shabbos and Chol, you can eat the Maser Sheni, and that's the reason why it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's how Rebbe wants to learn the Brisa, and now we're showing that the Machlekes Tanoim is really there is really a Machlekes Tanoim on this whole question all the way through. The Shitaso, one man to Omar holds Ma'akev, Shabbos or not, and the Shitaso, the Rabbi Lezer, the other Rabbi Lezer, the other Tana holds it's not Ma'akev, regardless of whether it's Shabbos or Chol. So we're not going to make a difference. Okay, so now let's take a look at Rashi.
It's a pretty heavy focus.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, it's again, the Tanoim had, as we like to say, they had very broad shoulders because they're taking upon themselves an interpretation. The Torah is ambiguous. The Torah does not give us a clear picture. So how are we to understand? So remember, the Tanoim were the early equivalent of the Shulchan Aruch. They were coming along saying, Chevra, the Torah doesn't tell us. We have to give a psak so people will know what to do. When you go to Eretz Yisrael, can you eat? Can you not eat? Can you redeem? Can the redemption in Chutz La'aretz eat, or the redeemer in Chutz La'aretz can't even eat because the Chumash wasn't given? These are very weighty questions because Maser Sheni was something that, remember, it's an agrarian society. A lot of people were in agriculture, and they had to. This mitzvah Maser Sheni isn't taken lightly. You got to give Maser Sheni. Now, if a person doesn't have the money to give the Chomesh, can he eat the Maser Sheni? I mean, that was a very critical question at the time, and we needed halacha to interpret it. And so the halacha was, if you follow Rabbi Eliezer, it's one thing, and if you follow Rabbi Yeshua, it's something else. That's why the Gemara says it's a machlokes Tanoim. Even in the time of the Tanoim, there was a dispute as to what the Torah meant about a Chomesh. I mean,
but they didn't really resolve it.
Again, they didn't resolve it. But again, you ask yourself the question, Halacha l'maaseh Sinai, why wasn't it clarified? Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu clarify when it says you give a chaimish, this is what it means?
Yeah.
Okay, it was left intentionally. I mean, the whole Torah is given in brevity. Why wasn't the Torah given in great detail? Teretz is because the Tanoim needed to have something to be able to argue on and to have a discussion. But you see how the wisdom of the Chazal is certainly, and again, you later we have the Shulchan Aruch, which helps clarify even more. Then you have the Paiskim, the Achronim. I mean, even today for Paiskim, whether it was Ramesh in his generation or the Paiskim today, to give incisive clarity on halacha is not just okay, I'll roll the dice, it comes out one, I'll give one answer and another. I mean, there has to be a weight behind it. There has to be a svara, there has to be a reason. And if not, that's why in the rare case the Gemara says teku. There are times when we cannot resolve exactly what the meaning of the Torah was, and we throw up our hands and say teku. Okay, I mean, you see that Machlaisus B'Shamai Beis Hillel, Rav, and Abai and Rava. I mean, these are all as a result of the Torah telling us something which we can then say, well, what did they really mean? And then again, that's the beauty of the Torah, and of course, the discussion in the Gemara and then beyond. Okay, so the Ma'akev B'Deraisa, about midway through, B'Masa Deraisa, Issa Midrabanan, B'Masa Demai Drabanan. In other words, if you have a Deraisa, you learn the Deraisa, and then we say that the Rabbanan follows the Deraisa. But if there isn't a Deraisa, because the whole Demai is Midrabanan, then it turns out that Demai does not have to be given. B'Shabbos, why Shabbos, according to Rabbi Eliezer? Mipnei Kvod Shabbos lo ya'akev mal'echol b'shvil chomesh. In other words, he didn't want to deprive a person from the tanuge of eating on Shabbos because of the chomesh. So the Gemara says, Midikam Rebbe divrei niran divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'Shabbos archel b'choil ein eroe es devarov. B'chlal the iu afilu b'chol omer yochel b'masa vadei ka'omer. Okay, we're talking about Maser Vadai because there is the real question, not on Demai. We call Alma Chomesh Loime Akev. Shiur Achila Loika Alav Mishum Lusucha Lechel B'Sharecha. Okay, so let's go back here. So now, so this is the question, and we see according to the Machlokes Tanoim. So now, okay, fine. Now we're not finished. So l'chayra, we don't, like you said, Jay, we don't have a definitive answer. Omar Rav Papa comes and says, "Lo, no, you've got it wrong. This is not the machlokes. What you just articulated as the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is not correct. Why? According to Rav Papa, the Kolal Machomesh Loimi Akev. There's no raya here to Rabbi Eliezer and to Rabbi Yeshua. Everybody holds Chomesh Lo Ma'akev, that the Chomesh of the Torah is not mandatory. It's not mandatory. What's the whole discussion? In other words, this is almost a question of maris ayin to an extent. Why? Because we're afraid that if you don't give the chomesh in real time and someone sees that, they'll say, chomesh? That's purely voluntary. I don't have to give a chomesh. In other words, the whole inyan of chomesh will crumble, because once you open the door to saying you don't have to give it in real time, someone may come along and say, I don't have to give it in real time. I don't have to give it. How do you know that someone won't extrapolate? Remember, the Chazal was very careful in many cases to create a protection around an issue because of, let's call it maris ayin, or the fact that someone will misinterpret what's going on here. If you go, and let's say you ask a shaila, and the Rav says, no, okay, go ahead and eat it, but make sure you give the chaimish. Okay, and they walk out, and people, oh, dancing with joy, he's going to be able to go to Yerushalayim, but not with the chaimish. And someone's going to say, oh, the psak was, I don't have to give a chaimish. So that's the lashon.
But also,
we're afraid of the pshia, of the carelessness of the edict, whether you give it or not, and then someone will say, I don't have to give it.
But
let me say, one version says we're afraid. Who's that? That's Rabbi Yeshua. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm not worried. People will give it even though they see that a person doesn't have to give it now. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, so, but it couldn't also be aside from the idea that somebody might see what's going on and think, oh, it's not really required. It could also just have the person forgets. They go ahead and they do this batch today and they redeem it and they do the 5. And then they do this batch the next day, they do the 5. And then the next day they go to do a batch and they weigh it and determine how much it is. And oops, I've only got enough to cover the baseline, the 4. I don't have the extra 5th. I'll do it tomorrow. And then he gets to tomorrow, he forgets.
No, you're right. You're right. That is certainly a concern as well for simple forgetfulness. The Gemara doesn't mention it, but certainly you can extrapolate that could be a problem. But the Gemara is going even further and saying, no, someone will intentionally say there's no chaimish here. the whole chaimish is negligible. That's even stronger than forgetting. Okay, forgetting. Okay, you say if someone forgets, he'll put a marker in, and once he sees the marker, he'll know he owes it, and he really wants to pay it. He doesn't want to cheat Hegdish or cheat Masasheni. He doesn't want to cheat Masasheni. He wants to be Mesameach with that extra fifth. Oh, he may forget, but here he has a marker. But someone says, forget about it. I don't even have to bring it. You can see here, I don't have to bring it. So, in other words, there's no proof that there's a question of whether it's ma'akiv or not. Everybody says it's not ma'akiv. But the reason you have to give it is because of the negligence that will arise out of it. And yes, it could be other things too. But so in other words, he wants to couch the machlokes in different terms so that you can't necessarily prove that the Tanoim had that argument as to whether or not it's ma'akiv or not, because according to this, it's not ma'akiv. But the whole question is, it's a siyag, right? We have siyag for other things. We have a siyag here too. You have to have a fence to protect from pshia, from negligence, or from carelessness. So Rashi says, so Rashi goes on and says, he'll just drop the whole question and never bring it. So the Gemara is left here with an important consideration, but no proof on the underlying question of whether it's ma'akiv or not. Okay, so
Rabbi,
yeah.
This may not make sense, but why can't you adjust the amount to include the chomesh and say, instead of 4 versus 5, if I have less than that, then it's equivalent to I'm giving a lesser amount and I'm eating a lesser amount value-wise with the chomesh by the amount that's actually given. In other words, why does it have to be a declaration? Why can't it automatically adjust to the lesser amount with the chomesh and still give a chomesh?
So that's a very interesting question, but we have to go back to the pasuk. In other words, this whole thing is learned from a pasuk, and and look at the words. Now we're talking about a different situation, but it's the same in Masasheni. Upode be'erkecha. You have to redeem it for its value. In other words, you have to get an objective appraisal of its value and redeem it for its value. You can't say, oh, I'll give a little bit less than the value and therefore I won't run into the chomish problem. Because if it's declared that the value is 4 zuzim, it's 4 zuzim. And then the next word is the Yosef Chamishi so alav, you add a 5th to the 4 zuzim. So the Torah made it clear that initially you have to do evaluation and you have to exchange money for that exact amount. Now, on top of that, you give a chomesh. Then the buzz was, well, what's the chomesh? Is the chomesh part of it? Is it not part of it? But your question goes to the underlying valuation, and there the Torah says, ufoda be'erkecha, and you have to redeem it for its value. How do you get around that?
Well, why can't you give more than its value, more than the 5th, and say, I'm going to redeem this for X? So just
more than the value of the product?
Yes. So I mean, I'm saying you're giving 5, let's say you give 5.5 zuz of value. I'm redeeming it for 4. I get +1 is a chomish. So the value that I'm redeeming it for is less than it's actually worth, but I've fulfilled my obligation by the chomish, and therefore I've met.
But you haven't redeemed now all of your produce. You've redeemed part of it.
Right. You haven't redeemed.
So you either have to come back later with more money to redeem the rest, or maybe you want to actually schlep some produce plus some money, and that would be allowed.
And the Torah doesn't tell us you can redeem the underlying value in part and then come back a second shot. No, that redemption has to be all or nothing. In other words, the 4 zuzim can't be 3 today and 1 next year. Or
right, but it could be 4 bushels, and you're going to get to the last bushel and a half from this example, 5.5. You're going to get to the last bushel and a half. You set it aside, and you see either you'll slap it or you'll redeem that before you hit the road.
Yeah, so
And that solves it, right? And that solves the problem.
well, it doesn't, again, so the actual redemption of the Masa Sheni is hard and fast, ironclad. Value it, you get a value, you redeem it for the value. Less mandapalik. No one argues that that is not the way to do it. So if you have 4 bushels of Masa Sheni and you want to do the mitzvah of redemption, then you have to give 4 zuzim for the 4 bushels and then add a chomish. So you can't argue on the 4 and say, well, I'll give 3 and hold 1 back because the Masa Sheni is on all 4. The Masa Sheni is on all 4. So you have to do,
Why
you have
can't
to
you
do it on
say
all
it's,
4.
so you're saying that the value is the value. You can't adjust
Correct.
the value. It's got to be the exact value of
The Masa Sheni, of the
Maser
real
Sheni, and
Masa Sheni food.
you can't back off to include the chomish in it. It's got to be value for value, and the chomish is over and above that. You
That's
cannot
right.
adjust
So
it.
the first monies always go to the actual Masa Sheni, and then you go to the Chomesh.
So it's
And then the question
it's
is,
an
okay,
add-on,
so
and
now
you
I don't have
can't-
enough money for the Chomesh. What do I do? So this is we have the machlokes. Comes Rebbe and says, no, wait a minute. There was a machlokes Tanoim, and the Tanoim took sides. Then Rav Papa says, no, they didn't take sides. Everybody says it's not ma'akiv. Everybody says that it's not mandatory. So you can redeem the 4 and get away with it, and not redeem the 5th. But Rabbi Yeshua says, wait a minute. The reason why I'm saying you have to do it is because then people will be careless and say, I don't have to do it. So I've got to protect the integrity of the Chomesh. Look, the Chomesh is midoraisa. The Chomesh isn't, oh, yes, an add-on. The Chomesh is midoraisa. It says midoraisa, you have to add a Chomesh. The question is, can you separate them so that the Chomesh doesn't hold back the Masa Sheni? But that doesn't mean the Chomesh isn't Minat Torah. It is Minat Torah. And the only question is, are you going to give it or not? So Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm not worried. And the Gemara will tell us in a minute why I'm not worried. I'm not worried. We'll get to it. Rabbi Yeshua says, not so fast. I'm not sure we're going to get to it because people will be careless and they'll say, I gave my portion already. I gave the Masa Sheni. I was Mekayim the mitzvah of the Torah. Now I can not worry about it. So he said, no, that's why I said, Siyag, you got to sort of make sure that sometimes you have to be a little stringent with people to make sure that they're fulfilling the mitzvah midaraisa. So and according to this, there's no raya that it's ma'akiv or not. So that's really the underlying machlokes. That's what we think. So what do we do? How do we reconcile? Okay, so so the Gemara now goes one step further. It says, you know how we're going to reconcile it? As follows. Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan is now going to Rav Papa's drasha, where he says that really it's not ma'akev, but we're worried about Shia. And he says, Hakol modim behektish shechilel. Okay, the Torah is talking about hektish, not Masa Sheni. So now we're going to do a sort of separation between Hegdish and Masa Sheni. That's what it's going to come down to now. Hakol modim behektish shechilel. Everybody, according to Rabbi Yochanan, everybody agrees that by Hegdish, you can be Mechalel Hegdish without the Chomesh. In other words, the Chomesh does not Ma'akev Hegdish. When you're dealing with the Kedusha of an item, which means you're dealing with the Bedek Habayis, with the Beis HaMikdash, then the Chomesh is not an afterthought, but is separated. Okay. Hol v'niskorin tovanosa b'shuk. So now this is the punchline: is that when it comes to Hegdish, you have the Gizber Hegdish. You have the temple police, and the temple police aren't going to let that go. So the Gizborim spread out around Yerushalayim. They know who's bringing Hegdish, they know who's redeeming, and they inquire, did you give a Chomesh? And if you didn't give a Chomesh, you got to give a Chomesh. So we're not worried that someone who is bringing Hegdish is going to let it fall between the cracks, because you have the treasury police, the Gizborin, who will be on top of you to make sure that you give the chomesh. Okay, so now we're now splitting hairs. We're saying that by Hegdish, since we're dealing with the Beis Hamikdash, and now you have to give your fair share, the chomesh will never slip between the cracks. However, we extrapolate, but Maser Sheni, we don't have Maser Sheni police. We don't have people going around all over Yerushalayim and looking at all the people all the farmers who came from Chutz Yerushalayim and making big parties and big simchas. We don't have police who are monitoring those occasions and asking, did you give the chomesh? So because of that, we don't know what's going to happen with the chomesh. That's the problem. But Maser Sheni is different than by Hegdish, than by being Mechalel Hegdish. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yochanan's teretz. Rabbi Yochanan's teretz is the Maser Sheni is a problem because Maser Sheni you can have that machlokes, but you can't have the machlokes by Hegdish, and the pasuk of Chomesh is by Hegdish. It's by not Maser Sheni. We learn Maser Sheni from Hegdish, but the pasuk itself is by Hegdish. So l'chayra Rabbi Yochanan now makes a difference. He splits the hair. Okay. So now the Gemara asks a kasha. So at least we see that we're trying to make a chilik between Maser Sheni and Hegdish. We're saying that Hegdish, we're not worried about Pshia because there will always be someone who is checking, right? The Gizber Hegdish, and Maser Sheni, which we only learn out from Hegdish, that's not the case. Frank the Gemara, Hegdish lo pligi. And you're telling me that by Hegdish everybody agrees not a problem because of the gizbar, because of the collection, we won't have a problem. That's not so. Why? Well, Tanya, we learned in another brisa. What does the brisa say? Nosan keren. If someone came to the Beis Hamikdash and he gave the keren, and he didn't give the chaimish to the Beis Hamikdash. Now we're talking about the Beis Hamikdash itself. So we're talking about the Beis Hamikdash itself, not Maser Sheni. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Chilel. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's now chol because you are able to you're able to be mechalel. But Chachamim Omrim lo Chilel, and that's by Hegdish. So you want to tell me there's a chiluk between Hegdish and Maser Sheni, and by Hegdish we're not going to, which is again the pasuk in the Torah is by Hegdish, and by Hegdish there is full control because of the Gizber Hegdish. Says the Gemara, no, there's a machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Chachamim whether or not you can even eat Hegdish without the chomesh. According to one man dama you can, and Rabbi Eliezer, and according to the Chachamim, if you don't give the chomesh, the Torah says you can't eat it. So we're back to square one. We thought we'd make a distinction between Hegdish and Maser Sheni. You see, there's no distinction. Even in Hegdish, there's a machlokes whether you can eat it or not. So why does Rabbi Yochanan say lo pligi? Everybody agrees. Everybody doesn't agree. So now comes the Gemara and says, Rebbe, Niran div Rabbi Eliezer v'Hegdish. We're going to use the same svara that we did earlier by Demai, and we're going to say that Rabbi Eliezer, that we follow the words of Rabbi Eliezer behegdish, that you can deconsecrate without the chomesh, and with regard to maser, we're going to follow the chachamim that you have to give the chomesh. So now we're using the same svara that we had in Demai to make a chilik between Hegdish and Demai, and say that Hegdish in the Torah, when the Torah says it, it meant that Chomesh was an add-on and not an integral part of the giving. But when it comes to Maser, to Demai, Divrei Chachamim b'Maser, and they are more stringent and saying that the Chomesh, the fifth, has to be secure. Okay, so at this point now we've put ourselves further into the discussion, right? That the machlok is that in Maser Sheni we're going to hold like the Chachamim that there is no equivocation. You must bring the Chomesh. Without the Chomesh, the whole Maser Sheni doesn't apply. So at this point, that's how we're looking at it. And we could say, okay, fine, we can make that legitimate distinction. And then the question, again, the Gemara isn't finished with this subject, but the Gemara is saying that that at least for now, Hegdish is different. Now, why should Hegdish be different? Again, it's nuancing from the Torah. The Torah didn't tell us by Maser Sheni to add a Chaimish. That we extrapolated and we said that just like Hegdish has, and Hegdish is a higher level of Kedusha than Maser Sheni, it is. So if by Hegdish you have to bring Hegdish and you have to bring a Chomesh, in Maser Sheni, we learned Pshat that if you, and remember, it doesn't apply to redeeming by a third party, but if you redeem your own Maser Sheni, then we're going to equivocate it. We're going to say, oh, it's like Hegdish. We're going to compare it to Hegdish. And we're going to say, just like if you redeem your own Hegdish, you have to bring a Chomesh. So too by Maser Sheni, even though you're not giving it to the Kohen, you're not giving it to the Levi, but still the Rebbeinu Shalom said, you yourself have to be Mesameach and let others participate in your simcha. David, as you said before, it's Almanos, Yesoimim, Aniyim, everybody, and they rely on that. They rely on the fact that when people come to be Mesameach in the Beis Hamikdash and in Yerushalayim, then they'll make a big Suda, and then people will partake in the Suda. That was part of the whole inyan of why the Rebbeinu Shalom said, bring Maser Sheni to Yerushalayim, because it wasn't just for you. It was for you, but it was for you to be Mesameach and make other people happy as well, who wouldn't have the means to on their own. So this is the how Jews have a welfare state, is to take care of each other, is to say, besides all of the mitzvahs, agricultural mitzvahs, and peah, shikra, lekach, for aniyim, we know all of that. There's a great degree of generosity that the farmers who were blessed have to share. But even when you're taking the produce to Yerushalayim, there's yet another chiyuv, and that chiyuv is Maser Sheni. But according to this, it doesn't rise to the level of the kedusha of being mechalel for the Beis Hamikdash. That kedusha, according to this discussion, has a different level of kedusha, and there we say that if you haven't brought the chomesh, we're not going to deprive the Beis Hamikdash of its share, and you still have to give it. So why? And again, it falls back to the fact that you have gizbarim, you have people to enforce. So one is tied into the other, ultimately, as to why we say that. But we see that we make a distinction between it. So, again, the Gemara continues on, and we'll have to stop because we'll pick it up with this thought. But again, at this point in time, what we've laid out is the intricacies of Maser Sheni and how Maser Sheni is compared to Kodesh, and all the great questions about the underlying reasons for why we were so makbid. And again, it all comes back to the lashon of the Torah, which tells us what the mitzvah is, but doesn't define for us in particularity how that mitzvah should be performed. And that gives rise to the machlokes. First machlokes tanoim, then it's not a machlokes tanoim, and how do we? And then so you have the different interpretations. Rabbi Papa, Rabbi Yochanan. So again, the beauty of the Gemara plays itself out. Now think about this, because that was the halacha of the time. If today we have, let's say, multiple poskim who will look at the halacha, and we didn't have a Shulchan Aruch, or the Shulchan, again, we have a Shulchan Aruch, and we have Beis Yosef, we have the Ramah, so you do have some differing views. But what happens in our poskim and our Achrayim today, if we have this ambiguity of whether or not a mitzvah that applies today, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no, maybe there's a loophole to the mitzvah, maybe there's not a loophole. We want clear definition. We want clarity. We don't want ambiguity. We don't want people going around and saying, oh, the halakha says this. No, you're wrong. The halakha says that. So this becomes really the question for our day, when you have poskim who, as has happened, of course, we know in the last generation, even Psak from the great Rav Moshe was not without controversy in some cases where people didn't agree. Why? Because their interpretation of what the halacha is based on the Torah, they came out with a slightly different view. So now you're left with the famous, Das Torah. So what do we do? How do we learn Pshat? So again, it's complicated. Let's just say that it's complicated, and we have to. That's why most smichas come on the back with either a phone number or ask your local rabbi. Again, sometimes it comes down to maybe minhagim on a halacha. In other words, there was a halacha, and in that halacha there may have been some ambiguity, and the interpretation. I give one good example. It has to do with Zmanei Tefillah, which I'm always amazed at, that different sects of Judaism have different understandings of Zmanei Tefillah. I mean, we live in a society where it's pretty clear when to daven Shkia and all the mitzvahs. There are parts of very, very frum Jewish society where it's not so clear. I've davened mincha in places where it was already night, the stars were shining, and we're davening mincha. Now, for most people, that's already way too late. But yet there are legitimate sects of from Yidden for whom the understanding is a little bit different. That's just one little example, but we probably can come up with others as to when halacha that we understand sort of butts up against halacha as someone else understands it. And here, this is an example of it in our Gemara today. So with that in mind, we'll all go out and do our halacha the way we're supposed to do it. And at the end of the day, we'll see what does the Eila Divra L'Kim Chayim, that the Rebbeinu Shalom will accept all of us without regard to how we, as long as we're following a disciplined approach to halacha, then hopefully we'll all be on the right track. All right. Everybody have an easy fast. Again, we should be Zaycha. All right. Everybody. Beautiful talk today.